Overall, the Australian response to the pandemic has been relatively effective so far. The number of reported cases began to climb steeply from the 10th of March. They reached what proved to be a peak of 460 cases on the 28th of March and have now declined to a very small daily number, mainly in the more populous southeastern states. The total number of confirmed cases on the 21st of May was just over 7,000, with 100 deaths out of a population of 5.5 million people. The Australian response has been assisted by natural advantages, including distance from the rest of the world. It also has benefited from Australia's relative prosperity, an effective health system, and strong scientific and medical communities. Nevertheless, timely and effective government action has been critical and has encouraged significant levels of public trust. The principal steps taken have included the following: effective closure of external and many internal state borders, mandatory 14-day quarantine for any new international arrivals, mandatory isolation at home and social distancing when out, with ancillary support to make compliance possible, extensive testing and tracing, most recently supported by a tracing app, rapid build-up of medical supplies and hospital capacity, some support for income and jobs, and a gradual and phased reopening in different stages in different parts of the country. The current challenge is to keep the virus under control while tackling the very significant economic problems resulting from it. 4 sets of constitutional issues that have arisen deserve specific mention. The first concerns federalism. Australia is a federation with a central government and 8 states or territories. Powers relevant to managing the pandemic are shared between them. Using them effectively requires coordination on some matters and a capacity to respond to local conditions on others. Intergovernmental relations in Australia have typically been top-down, using techniques of command and control rather than genuine cooperation. For the purposes of the pandemic, however, Australia managed to break that mould in an approach that draws on the perspectives of all jurisdictions, has encouraged their commitment, and has ensured collective ownership. The mechanism was a new institution, the National Cabinet, comprising the Prime Minister and the Premiers of all states and territories. The National Cabinet has coordinated policies on some matters, including procurement, while accepting the need for diversity and local responsiveness in others, including the extent of lockdown. It brought together leaders from different sides of politics in a genuinely collaborative exercise. It drew on the expertise of a committee of medical officers from all jurisdictions. Members of the Cabinet used press conferences frequently to announce and explain decisions, including local variations, and the National Cabinet quickly built confidence in the government's approach across Australian communities. A second set of issues concerns democratic representation. Australia has parliamentary systems at both levels of government. As the crisis developed, parliamentary sittings were minimised in every sense and budgets postponed. And even greater than usual authority was delegated to executive governments, including sometimes to health officials, under emergency-type legislation to make decisions and spend money. Many of the decisions affected individual rights, including, most obviously, liberty, and the sums of money involved have been huge. These developments are worrying, but partly balanced by other factors. Law continues to depend on parliamentary authorisation, albeit often through delegation. Most of the more extreme measures are expressed to be time-limited, and in most jurisdictions, one or more parliamentary committees has retained a broad overview of developments. Nevertheless, in the short term, the impact of the pandemic has been to severely weaken government accountability through parliamentary processes. Thirdly, accountability has been further complicated by the operations of the National Cabinet. Intergovernmental decision-making processes always concentrate power in the executive branch and weaken parliamentary accountability unless countermeasures are deliberately put in place. In this case, the problem is compounded by a lack of transparency about which decisions are taken through National Cabinet and what the decision-making rules for National Cabinet are. Further confusion may be caused by calling the body a cabinet at all. Clearly, this is not a cabinet in the familiar sense of the term. Members are not drawn from the same parliament, and the usual rules of cabinet solidarity cannot apply. On the contrary, all the participants are accountable to cabinets, parliaments, and people of their own. And it's relevant for present purposes that the terminology of cabinet apparently was used to shield the body from freedom of information legislation, a stopgap solution that needs to be rethought for the longer term. Finally, there is a set of miscellaneous constitutional issues thrown up by the circumstances of the pandemic. There are question marks around the constitutional validity of internal border closures, for example, especially as case numbers fall. Privacy concerns have been raised by the COVID-19 tracing app, which are not entirely overcome by the supporting legislation that was rather belatedly passed. And the postponement of other important measures, including, for example, the establishment of a federal anti-corruption commission, have been justified on the basis of the crisis. Crises come in different forms and may raise different constitutional issues. Some insights may be drawn from the COVID-19 emergency, however, to prepare for other crises in the future. First, when working properly, federalism can be a very effective form of government for dealing with problems of this kind. It can combine the advantages of collective action on a large scale with the responsiveness and sense of community that smaller jurisdictions typically offer. Secondly, one way of achieving this result, even in the face of a crisis, is through a genuinely national collaborative approach in which all participating jurisdictions own the outcome and in which diversity is accepted as appropriate, indeed beneficial. Thirdly, the problems of accountability that have emerged in connection with the National Cabinet could be overcome by greater transparency of its purposes and procedures, better understanding that an intergovernmental body is accountable to multiple governments, parliaments, and peoples, and processes that ensure that each of those avenues of accountability is real. Fourth, it would be useful to prepare in advance for parliaments to be able to operate remotely on a more consistent and effective basis, drawing on experiences from around the world. And fifth, public trust and cooperation is essential for handling a crisis of this kind. It depends on honest and clear communication by elected representatives, relying on expert advice, but also taking community needs into account. Three more general insights might be drawn from Australian experience for constitutional law more generally. First, the crisis has reinforced the need for democratic institutions within states to work effectively and to develop policies that take account of expertise. Secondly, Australians as a whole have appreciated the bipartisanship and professionalism of the National Cabinet process. It would be useful to think about how this could be replicated in parliaments in place of the petty politicking that presently dominates proceedings, without undermining the accountability role of Parliament and the need for the opposition to be able to present itself as an alternative government. And third, the end of the immediate crisis will offer an occasion to review what was done to ensure that constitutional values, principles, and processes are not only restored, but improved. Finally, some general reflections from a regional perspective. Many of the regional experiences confirm the impressions already gained from Australia. Smaller jurisdictions can have advantages in managing a crisis of this kind, from which federations also can benefit. Building community trust is essential. Effective communication is critical. In addition, there have been innovations across the region from which Australia could well learn. The approach to managing elections in difficult circumstances, as in, for example, South Korea. The enhancement of accountability that has been shown to be possible through New Zealand practice, with a high-level parliamentary committee that met during the height of the crisis and public release of the COVID-related cabinet documents. And another example from which Australia could learn, the comprehensive, multifaceted approach to managing the pandemic demonstrated in, for example, the Indian state of Kerala. As comparative exercises like this proceed, more examples of innovations undoubtedly will emerge from which Australians and others can learn. Thank you.